It's my very great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Andrew Robinson, who's written a very wonderful book called The Last Man Who Knew Everything, and that's going to be the subject of his talk, except the title reveals who was the last man who knew everything. It was Thomas Young.
Thank you very much. I don't take the title that seriously, but we'll come to that. The portrait of Thomas Young here was painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence, who was a famous society painter of the 1820s. And it's from around this time, the 1820s, that we have a charming and revealing story about Young told by his friend Mary Somerville. In her memoirs, which were put together after her death by one of her daughters, Somerville recalls how she and her husband and another couple, also known to Young, had been stargazing in central London with a telescope until about 2 o'clock in the morning, when they happened to notice a candlelight in the window of Young's house in nearby Welbeck Street. So clearly Thomas was burning the midnight oil again. Now, Mary's husband, William, who was a former army doctor and fellow of the Royal Society, knocked on the door, rang the doorbell at number 48. And Young, who was also a medical doctor and a fellow of the Society, appeared personally in his dressing gown and said, "Come in, I have something curious to show you." And so they were invited inside to see a piece of ancient Egyptian papyrus, which had been found in a mummy case. And Young had then started trying to translate it back in London. And he said that this very evening he had proved it to be a horoscope of the age of the Ptolemies and had determined the date from the configuration of the heavens at the time of its construction. Well, a few years ago, just after Christmas in 2015, Thomas Young made a rare appearance on University Challenge, the BBC TV quiz programme. And presenter Jeremy Paxman challenged two teams of distinguished university alumni from Aberdeen and Durham to identify, quote, a physician and physicist born in Somerset in 1773, who established the principle of interference of light and was instrumental in deciphering the Rosetta Stone. Well, I remember watching, and there was a slightly puzzled pause, and then the captain of the Durham University team, Monica Grady, who was a space scientist, spoke up and said, Thomas Young. Well, the following year, 2016, the Thomas Young Centre in London organised a dinner to celebrate its 10th anniversary. And they asked me to say a few words about him as his biographer. It's an affiliation of well-known universities in London. I won't go into the details, but it was established in 2006. Now, I did enjoy just speaking a bit about him, but I had to admit I didn't know why, at the time I spoke, they had called the centre after Thomas Young. And so this year, I decided to try and find out the answer to this question while I was introducing the Thomas Young Centre into a revised edition of my biography, The Last Man Who Knew Everything. This was first published in 2006, shortly after the Thomas Young Centre was founded, and it's now been republished for the 250th birth anniversary of Young in 2023, with a foreword by Sir Martin Rees. That's the cover. Now, I got in touch with one of the Centre's 4 co-founders, Professor Michael Finnis, who's at Imperial College in London. And he joined there in 2006, and he's now a professor working in the Department of Physics and of Materials. And Mike explained to me this year how this proposal of Young's name came about. It's quite interesting. He said he consulted 2 senior colleagues who were interested in the idea of founding an interdisciplinary centre. and they put forward at least two possible suggestions for names based on eminent British scientists who had been awarded Nobel Prizes for physics in the early 20th century. The Rayleigh Centre, after the mathematician and physicist Lord Rayleigh, and the Thomson Centre, after the physicist J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron. But Finnis told me he thought that these two names, Rayleigh and Thomson, might be less appealing to materials scientists and engineers than to physicists. And one morning, he said in 2006, he was browsing a copy of Physics World, which I'm sure you know is the monthly magazine of the Institute of Physics. And he happened to read an extensive article there entitled Thomas Young, Physician and Polymath, which I'd written in the run-up to the publication of the biography. And that's what it looks like, the title page. And Mike said to me, I immediately thought, this is it, the Thomas Young Centre, it would be. He told me in an email, he's then explained, my thought, which was accepted by colleagues without any quibbles, was that our centre would be interdisciplinary, involving chemists, engineers, physicists, and material scientists. And all of them would have learned at some time about one or more of Young's achievements. And then he listed Young's modulus of elasticity for material scientists and engineers, Young's slits for physicists, the Young-Dupre equation for physical chemists. And then he said, these are not compartments that are helpful in research. And Thomas Young seemed to represent the epitome of interdisciplinary thinking. Well, I think that's how Young appears to many academics in 2023 as an interdisciplinary thinker. But in his own time, 2 centuries ago, he was generally known as a polymath, a word that's, in my view, not much used in modern specialized science. You do see it occasionally, but not very often. Well, who were the polymaths in the 19th century, along with Young? Charles Darwin was best known as a biologist, but I'd say he was certainly a polymath. He contributed to zoology, botany, geology, paleontology, and philosophy, not to mention literature. Had he been required to do a PhD in the biology of barnacles and then joined the University Life Sciences Department, rather than circumnavigating the planet on the HMS Beagle for 5 years between 1831 and 36, I think it's difficult to imagine him having the varied experiences and exposure to different disciplines that led to his discovery of the principle of natural selection and the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859. Other remarkable 19th century polymaths include Hermann Helmholtz, who was active in physics, medicine, anatomy, the perception of art, and the theory of music. Karl Marx, reputed for his work in philosophy, history, economics, sociology, and politics. Florence Nightingale, renowned as the founder of modern nursing, was also an important social reformer and a statistician. John Ruskin, celebrated for his art criticism, who was active in geology, history, economics, and philosophy. And then there's William Whewell, spelt W-H-E-W-E-L-L, but he's, I think, pronounced Whewell. He was inventor of the term scientist in 1833, along with the term physicist and the term linguistics, along with ion, anode, and cathode. And he was a scientist, a priest, a philosopher, a theologian, and a historian of science in Cambridge. Now, in the 20th century, there are fewer probably famous polymaths, but it still remains a significant force. Linus Pauling contributed not only to physical chemistry and mathematical physics, but also to biology, medicine, and of course international peace, which won him 2 Nobel Prizes. Erwin Schrödinger, very famous for his work in physics, but also remembered in experimental psychology, biology, and philosophy. Alan Turing, a pioneer of computing, of course, but also a mathematician, philosopher, cryptanalyst, engineer, and biologist. And then Alfred Wegener, it's worth mentioning, is best known for his theory of continental drift, of course, but he was a climatologist, a geologist, a paleontologist, geophysicist, meteorologist, and polar researcher. But I think the most polymathic person in the 5 centuries since Leonardo da Vinci is Thomas Young. Now, the standard heritage plaque on his London house, where Mary Somerville and her party knocked on the door, labels him simply man of science. There you are. It lacks space to mention that he made significant contributions as a physician, as a physiologist, as a physicist, as a philologist, as an Egyptologist, and as a writer. And I'll try and touch on all of these. Unlike Darwin, not everyone, even in the academic world, has heard of Young, I think it's fair to say. And I did a piece about him for Science recently, and my editor at Science said we had a meeting to discuss pieces, and quite a few people there did not know who Young was. So it varies. Many people do, but some don't. Now, those who have studied his work are mostly amazed by both its depth and its breadth. If you consider just his physicist admirers, after he died, the astronomer Sir John Herschel called him a truly original genius and added that to do anything approaching to justice to his reputation would call for the exercise of powers more nearly allied to his own than I can pretend to boast. And then later in the 19th century, Hermann Helmholtz stated, I think quite importantly, that Young was one of the most acute men who ever lived, but had the misfortune to be too far ahead in advance of his contemporaries. And then at the end of the century, in 1899, Lord Rayleigh gave a lecture on the centenary of the Royal Institution, where Young had once been a professor of natural philosophy. And Rayleigh declared simply, while discussing Young's work, Young occupies a very high place in the estimation of men of science, higher indeed now than at the time when he did his work. And then finally, I'll mention in 1931, a century after Young, Einstein referred to Young as follows in the foreword to the 4th edition of Newton's great treatise, Optics, which Einstein was writing the foreword to. And he said, "Fortunate Newton, happy childhood of science. Nature to him was an open book, whose letters he could read without effort. Finally come his observations of the colours of thin films as the origin of the next great theoretical advance, which had to await over 100 years the coming of Thomas Young." Now, I won't say much about this because there's a lot of physicists here, and you'll all know about the double slit experiment. This is probably his most famous single scientific achievement, and this is the drawing that he published in his famous lectures in 1807, showing the double slit. And I'll just read you his caption because it's quite brief and quite nicely done. He says, describing it, "The manner in which 2 portions of coloured light admitted through 2 small apertures produce light and dark stripes or fringes by their interference, proceeding in the form of hyperbolas. The middle ones are, however, usually a little dilated, as at the point A at the bottom." Well, as for the Rosetta Stone, and I'm afraid I'm going to switch a lot in this little talk, anyone who studies ancient Egypt knows that in 1815 to 19, Young cracked as you might say, part of the mysterious hieroglyphic script on the stone by recognizing the name of the Egyptian ruler Ptolemy as written in phonetic hieroglyphs. He managed to spell out the name. Now, this breakthrough included, or launched, I would say, the decipherment of the entire system of Egyptian hieroglyphs by the French Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s. And I've also written a book about Champollion. They're fantastically different scientists and people. It's a fascinating parallel. They were working side by side, but in rivalry. Now, in addition, Young was the first person since the end of the Roman Empire to be able to read the second Egyptian script written on the Rosetta Stone, now known as the Demotic script. And this he revealed in his final posthumously published book, which he was working on right up to his death, entitled Rudiments of an Egyptian Dictionary. That's a rather charming manuscript by Young, his notes on the Rosetta Stone, sometime between 1815 and 1819, from the British Library collections of his Egyptological papers. And very sadly, almost all his other papers disappeared in the 19th century. So his original biographer, George Peacock, had access to a lot of papers which have vanished. Nobody knows what's happened to them, except the Egyptological papers, which are in the British Library. Now, amazingly, even for the period of Young, he had no formal training, either in the study of physics or of ancient Egypt. His only formal training was in medicine, acquired in the 1790s when he studied at medical establishments in Edinburgh, London, and Göttingen in Germany. And it's medicine that led to his important discoveries in physiology, which I'll touch on, prior to his discoveries in physics. In fact, and I think this is really important, it was Young's fascination with the structure of the human eye as a physician and as a physiologist that led to his subsequent fascination with the physics of light. So it started with medicine and moved on to physics in his life. And this is, I think, surely an excellent example of the value of polymathy. And this is just a bit of fun, really. It's a modern painting, and actually I don't know who the artist was, showing Young at home in Welbeck Street, operating or trying to measure his eye. And he did some rather frightening experiments at home, all on his own, sticking things into his eyes. And it's partly through these courageous experiments that he was the first to explain how the human eye focuses on objects at varying distances, what we now call accommodation, the power of accommodation. And he also discovered the phenomenon of astigmatism, which his own eyes suffered from, along with many, many others at that time. And in 1801, he proposed the three-colour theory of vision, and in the words of James Clerk Maxwell, the physicist, Thomas Young was the first who, starting from the well-known fact that there are three primary colours, sought for an explanation of this fact, not in the nature of light, but in the constitution of man. Well, Young's three-colour theory was finally confirmed experimentally only in 1959 by studies of the human retina. And according to a 20th century neurophysiologist, an influential figure called John Zachary Young, who was a descendant of Young, his ancestor, Thomas, was, quote, the founder of all modern neurophysiology by his claims that the nerves carry information by their varying types. Now, in addition to physics, Egyptology, and physiology, Young was a major scholar in ancient Greek. I won't say much about it, but I will show you this beautiful vellum manuscript in his handwriting. And it's a translation that he had made of a speech in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. Lord Wolsey saying goodbye to Cromwell, I believe. And this made Young quite famous with his rich doctor relative who was fascinated by Greek as well. And the doctor started to help educate the young boy, or the adolescent boy. He was a phenomenal linguist. He compared the vocabulary and grammar of some 400 languages. And in 1813, he introduced the term Indo-European, that's his coinage, to describe the family that includes Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, following the work of Sir William Jones, an Oxford figure. But the term is Young's, Indo-European. And he was an extraordinarily prolific and authoritative writer, mainly for the Encyclopaedia Britannica, on all matter of other subjects, from carpentry, bridge building and weights and measures, to music, life insurance and ocean tides, as well as biographies of eminent scientists and scholars. Indeed, I think he wrote more contributions to the Encyclopaedia Britannica than any other contributor in its history. And the editor acknowledged that in the early days, that almost every department of this encyclopedia has had something from Young. Now, as for his professional appointments, he was a professor of natural philosophy at the Royal Institution when it had just been founded. And in 1802-3, he delivered what's generally regarded as the most far-reaching series of lectures ever given by a scientist, 60 lectures entitled Natural Philosophy and the Mechanical Arts. And I can't resist sharing this with you. It's a satirical caricature of one of these Royal Institution lectures, drawn by James Gilray, published in May 1802, and it catches an atmosphere, I think, of earnestness mixed with farce. It's got a facetious title, Scientific Researches, New Discoveries in Pneumatics, or an experimental lecture on the powers of air. And it shows one lecturer on the left determinedly administering gas to the mouth of a guinea pig, who is Sir J.C. Hippersley. He was one of the managers of the institution, and it said he was a well-known snob, and it's producing the most disastrous effect in his breeches, as you can see. Well, the other lecturer, chubby-cheeked with a mischievous glint in his eyes, is holding a pair of powerful smoking bellows. And then in the audience on the far right, standing, is Count Rumford, the founder of the Royal Institution. He's watching rather enigmatically, while various male members of the upper classes attempt to maintain a scholarly solemnity. A woman throws up her hands theatrically, and some members of the lower orders, in those days, both male and female, treat this serious scientific affair more like a music hall turn. Well, the first lecturer is likely to be Young. We don't know for sure. It could be Thomas Garnet. The second one, with the bellows, is unquestionably Humphrey Davy. Gilray did not identify, unfortunately, anyone by name, so we can't be sure. But the face of the first lecturer does look quite like Lawrence's portrait of Young, the only portrait that exists of him in his life. And the date, 1802, is compatible with Young's lectures, not with Thomas Garnet. On the other hand, we do know from the diary of Lady Holland that in March of 1800, Garnet administered this recently discovered laughing gas, nitrous oxide, to Hippersley. And the effect on him, according to Lady Holland's diary, was so animating that the ladies tittered, held up their hands, and declared themselves satisfied. However, this date, 1800, is not compatible with the presence of Davy, who didn't start at the Royal Institution till 1801. So there's a bit of confusion, but Gilray didn't help us, and it sounds as if he may have depicted various incidents at various times in one caricature, not just one lecture, with different people who are historically from that period. Now, other notable appointments held by Young were as follows. He was a physician at a major London hospital, St George's, near Hyde Park, for a quarter of a century. He was Inspector of Calculations, as they called it, for a leading company, Palladium Life Insurance, in the 1820s, which paid him a substantial salary for his medical and mathematical knowledge of life insurance. He was the secretary of the Admiralty's Board of Longitude, and he was superintendent of this vital nautical almanac from 1818 until his death. And in addition, in 1794, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society at the age of barely 21, became its Foreign Secretary in 1804 at the age of 30, and turned down the presidency of the Royal Society in his 50s, not long before his death, upon the retirement of Humphrey Davy. The reason seems to be Young didn't relish official responsibilities, and that's probably why he never became Sir Thomas Young, unlike Humphrey Davy, who was Sir Humphrey Davy, because he somewhat preferred to stay out of government business and official limelight. Yet, in an exhibition honouring Thomas Young, I came across this note from the Science Museum. It was for his bicentenary in 1973, and the Science Museum organisers commented for the exhibition, Young probably had a wider range of creative learning than any other Englishman in history. He made discoveries in nearly every field he studied. Well, he was a restless man intellectually. He certainly enjoyed focusing on a problem, as witness his statement to a close Quaker friend here. I like a deep and difficult investigation when I happen to have made it easy for myself, if not to all others. Scientific investigations are a sort of warfare carried on in the closet or on the couch against all one's contemporaries and predecessors. I've often gained a signal victory when I've been half asleep, but more frequently found on being thoroughly awake that the enemy had still the advantage of me when I thought I had him fast in a corner. And all this, he says to his friend, you see, keeps one alive. But it has to be said that Young generally moved on long before he had fully explored his intuitions and his discoveries. And as a result, his reputation suffered, which he certainly knew and he naturally regretted. In medicine, despite his impressive qualifications and considerable publications, which I haven't mentioned, but there are a number of them, his private practice never flourished, at least partly because Young refused to obey an unwritten professional law that successful physicians should practice nothing but medicine. And this is a point made by David Wetherell here at Oxford when he was writing about my book, that Young is an example of how you can combine different abilities with a profession such as medicine. And Wetherell believed it's dying out, and he was worried about it. And he found Young's example quite inspiring. Now, one of the long letters Young wrote to his favourite sister-in-law, Emily, includes a nonsense verse, which I'll quickly read to you, written on a Latin model, and it touches on this divided attitude he has to his chosen profession, medicine. It goes, "Medical men my mood mistaking, most mawkish monstrous messes making, molest me much, more manfully my mind might meet my malady, medicine's mere mockery murders me." He did apologize to his sister-in-law afterwards. He said, this is one of my private obsessions. Not a very good poem, but in the last line, you sense, I think, a deliberate ambiguity, that medical men are mocking him as a dilettante physician, while medicine, he says, is mocking medical men because they are failing to progress medicine as a science. For example, when he wrote this nonsense poem in 1815, not even the stethoscope had been invented. It was invented the following year, in fact. Now, in an autobiographical sketch intended for a posthumous edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Young said about polymathy, whether the public would have been more benefited by his confining his assertions, his exertions, within narrower limits is a question of great doubt. He himself was unsure. And after his death in 1829, the president of the Royal Society couldn't help but echo Young's own ambivalence towards his polymathy in a valedictory address. The president said, "Young's example is only to be followed by those of equal capacity and equal perseverance, and rather recommends the concentration of research within the limits of some defined portion of science than the endeavour to embrace the whole." Well, there was regrettably little further public tribute after Young's passing away, but he does have a plaque in Westminster Abbey, which was put up soon after his death. In one of the chapels, you can see that he keeps company with Sir James Young Simpson, the discoverer of chloroform, the physician Matthew Bailey, who had taught Young, Sir Humphrey Davy, his fellow lecturer at the Royal Institution, Lord Rayleigh, who greatly admired his physics, and the engineer Thomas Telford, whose iron bridge proposal Young had supported across the Thames. And finally, the actress Sarah Siddons, whose performances Young had enjoyed when he was a medical student in Edinburgh. They're all there together in that chapel. And it's suitably diverse and distinguished company for him, I think. And that's the medallion that appears showing his posthumously created by Sir Francis Chantry, a sculptor of that time, in the chapel. And there's a plaque, which is very brief but worth reading. It says, "Sacred to the memory of Thomas Young, M.D., a man alike eminent in almost every department of human learning, patient of unintermitted labour, endowed with the faculty of intuitive perception, who, bringing an equal mastery to the most abstruse investigations of letters and science, first established the undulatory theory of light and first penetrated the obscurity which had veiled for ages the hieroglyphics of Egypt." Well, I'll now finish. Whether one admires polymaths seems to me a matter of taste, not objective judgment. But it should surely be indisputable that a man of sweeping vision like Young has a place in science as valuable as the more narrowly focused physicist Rayleigh or the Egyptologist Champollion. In Young's own perceptive words, it's probably best for mankind that the researches of some investigators should be conceived within a narrow compass, while others pass more rapidly through a more extensive sphere of research. At any rate, he's surely an appropriate and inspiring figurehead for the Thomas Young Centre in London. One reason is, of course, this astonishing range of his expertise. Another reason is his lifelong commitment to both London and to the internationalism of science, through his strong contacts with France, which honoured him highly as a scientist, and also Germany and Italy. And yet another reason, I think, is his commitment to useful research, epitomised by his lectures at the Royal Institution and his various public works for the government, including the Board of Longitude. A final reason, perhaps less obvious, which occurred to me when I was writing the biography, is that Young loved thought experiments, like Einstein and many theoretical physicists, more than physical experiments. He once remarked, "Acute suggestion was always more in the line of my ambition than experimental illustration." There's even a possibility that the double-slit experiment was actually a thought experiment, not a physical experiment performed at his house in London. We can't be sure, but when he published it in his 1807 Natural Philosophy and the Mechanical Arts, his book of lectures, he did not explicitly state that he did the experiment. He provided no numerical data of any sort. He said nothing about the light source that he used and the other experimental conditions. And amazingly, he never again referred to the experiment after 1807. Even so, I think it's continued, the double-slit experiment, to be repeated by physicists for more than 2 centuries with unimaginably more sophisticated and sensitive apparatus than available to Thomas Young. And I think it encapsulates, if you trust the Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, who said in 1965, "This experiment is the heart of quantum mechanics, its only mystery." And I think that's still true in 2023. Thank you.
Well, many thanks for that wonderfully wide-ranging talk, which I imagine will stimulate some wide-ranging questions. Who would like to start? Yes, in the centre of the front row.
Just to reinforce what you said about Feynman, what Feynman said was, when you observe that the same thing happens with electrons, if you believe that, you believe anything.
Yes. Feynman had a good sense of humour. Young was a little short on that, I have to admit.
So the man there in the middle, there.
Sorry, I've often looked at historic people like this and thought, what must their lives have been like? I wish I had a life like, if I was in the past, I wish I had a life like that. That must have been amazing. But to complete the picture, what was his home life like?
Everyone always asks, was he always doing thought experiments or real experiments and nothing else? He was actually pretty sociable. His wife, who he married quite early, Eliza, they didn't have children, but she was very interested in his work. There's a famous episode where she suddenly goes out of the room when there's an argument with some French scientists who want to know what he believes about a certain aspect of physics, and she returns without saying a word with the relevant paper that he published and said, this is the thing you need to look at. And they all took the point. And after his death, which was quite early, George Peacock, the biographer, the Cambridge biographer, says that the wife approached him many times with affectionate constancy, trying to persuade him, he's very busy, to write about Young because she felt it was really important he should be remembered. And I think there are one or two sort of quite nice stories about him which I haven't been able to tell, where he's obviously good. I mean, he keeps a diary and writes to Emily, the sister-in-law, about having had a long talk with the president of the Royal Academy, Benjamin West, and how he's a bit suspicious of West's portrayal of the same face over and over again. You know, and there's a lot of details like that. He liked his sister-in-law very much. It's lively.
Yeah, there's a man there.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So if Young's slits experiment, the double slit experiment, was just a thought experiment, how would he expected fringes, and how would have other people taken this to be a correct experiment if it was just a thought experiment?
Well, there's a dispute about it between experts. I think I'm not enough of an expert to make any comment on either side, but there is I can't remember the two names now. Naum Kipnis is one of the people who've written about it. I personally feel it must have been conducted, but for reasons that we can't say. He didn't give a lot of detail because it's just not likely that he wouldn't have done it. He did conduct earlier experiments of a similar nature, and he gave details of how he did them, including how he made holes in cards and slits and things of that nature, and light from the window. In some cases, other light sources he also gives details of. I think that the trouble was Young, by 1807, when he wrote up the lectures, I don't want to run away from the question, but he was becoming rather upset at the thought that he was losing his medical profession because he wasn't practicing. And he wanted to get these lectures published and then concentrate on medicine. And I think that may have been something to do with the brevity of certain aspects of the way he reported his work, but we can't be sure, unfortunately.
I was at a lecture at the Royal Institution about 8 or 10 years ago. I can't remember who the lecturer was, unfortunately, but they did a demonstration of the double slit experiment using a laser beam and television camera, and mentioned en passant that the last time that was done here was by Thomas Young. I think it was 1802, the first public demonstration of the double slit experiment.
Well, I don't think that's accurate, but I may be wrong. I have had some dealings with the Royal Institution over the years, and it's sometimes difficult to get clear accounts of what did happen in that period. I know because I went to a meeting with one of their people on Monday, and we were talking about the difficulty of trying to get evidence from that time. I'm sorry if they said that, because I don't think there's any evidence it happened.
Yes, go there, and then there's a question there.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I would like to just mention another contribution that Young made to physics, which I know that the speaker is aware of, and that is the work on capillarity in the beginning of the 19th century. This was a phenomenon which had puzzled natural philosophers ever since Leonardo, and certainly puzzled Newton. And through his knowledge of the geometry of curved surfaces, Thomas Young made a very important contribution to our understanding of capillarity, independently of the great French mathematician Laplace, who exactly at the same time came up with similar ideas. In fact, nowadays, it's sometimes referred to as the Young-Laplace equation. And this was important because it had a lot to do with our understanding of intermolecular forces. And perhaps the most spectacular application of capillarity is in the late 19th century, in the understanding of how trees lift water to their leaves over 100 meters. And this has a lot to do with the phenomenon of capillarity inside leaves.
Well, thank you very much, Harvey. I'm sorry it doesn't feature much in the book, but this is part of the problem, trying to fit him into one book.
So let's take a question from the woman now.
Hi, really good talk. You mentioned about him being quite interested in his medical practice. Could you speak a little bit more about, did he have a particular specialisation? What was he actually doing when he was practicing medicine, and why did he feel it was important to go back to it? And also, how did he physically fit his experiments in things like, light and Young's modulus? So he's obviously some sort of an engineer. Was he doing those at home, and how did he get his equipment? Because we've heard about Hooke and all of the practical equipment that he had. I don't know quite what Young's availability of actual kind of scientific equipment was, and what was he doing. So a little bit of how did he fit it all in, and where was he actually doing this?
Well, these are somewhat frustrating questions about his home, because there must have been some equipment there, and he doesn't tell us very much about the working conditions. When he's working on his eye with simple equipment, and he does describe how he sticks a sort of bolt into the back to measure a distance that he wants to establish. So there is some description of equipment, but of a very simple kind. But the house is never, sadly, described by him, even in his extensive writing. So we don't know. As for the hospital, there are various reports of him as a doctor in St George's after he was elected in a quite tight contest with Dr. Roget of Roget's Thesaurus, was a runner-up, and Young just pipped somebody and managed to get the job. And that's where we have reasonable records. But frankly speaking, there's a lot of criticism of him from professional colleagues. Fair or not, it's hard to tell. He certainly was he did a lot of ward rounds. I mean, he certainly did his job in that respect. But what is not clear is whether he had certain specialisms. There is an early book he published. He suffered from a condition when he was young, which almost did him in, and he did write extensively about that in his Introduction to Medical Literature. So you can read him on serious medical subjects if you want to, in that book. But as a practitioner, there's not an awful lot of first-hand evidence from him about his medical practice. There is more evidence from others.
Okay, we've got just the last question here, and then we have to stop, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that. I mean, my understanding is that medical knowledge at that time was almost entirely wrong, that people didn't know about microbes, and a lot of the ideas of how diseases work were wrong, and treatments often did more harm than good. So I just wondered how that sat with his scientific approach. Was it, did he realise that a lot of this actually wasn't right?
It's a very true point from his point of view. Roy Porter writes in his History of Medicine something about the context of Young's life at that time. And I think it was the underlying difficulty for him as a medic, is that he wasn't prepared to espouse views he didn't agree with. Treatments, bloodletting or whatever it might be, which was popular at that time. He was not prepared to support what he thought was unevidenced, and it undoubtedly upset some people on those grounds that he wasn't prepared to stand by what they believed in and follow them in their practice. And he was even prepared to be critical publicly as to it being some form of quackery. And so that was bound to diminish his reputation, I think. Benjamin Brodie wrote about him, who's quite a famous medical figure of that time, and he even performed the dissection after he died, and he had rather mixed opinions of Young, but I would say Young survives, whereas Brodie doesn't really now. So perhaps its justice has been served 2 centuries later.
Well, that seems an absolutely perfect place to stop. If you, we have a general discussion later. But first of all, we've got to thank Andrew for a wonderful talk.